Well, thank you, Tom. It's good to be home again, and I really am home, just 5 minutes away. This is always good. It's always tough to follow John. I'm not really sure how I'll do here, but we'll do the best. We'll do the best that we can. I'm here, among other things, to represent the non-controversial candidate for president, the one whose name is hard to remember, the one who never says anything that irks people, the one whose every hair is in place, my friend Donald Trump. And I would like to start out with that, but first I would like to say it's good to be here in Pennsylvania with the Pennsylvania Leadership Conference. I remember in the course of my career many interesting fights and primaries between presidential candidates, notably between former Governor Ronald Reagan and Ambassador George H.W. Bush. And it was quite the fight, along with the one 4 years earlier between Governor Reagan and President Ford. I remember being in this room when then Senator Dick Schweiker was making an appeal for the Pennsylvania delegation to support a Reagan-Schweiker ticket. And alas, he didn't get anywhere with it. And President Ford managed to sweep through the convention. He won it by about 117 votes, as I recall, and Governor Reagan came back. So there are a lot of memories here, and it's just good to be home with all of my fellow Pennsylvania conservatives. So let me begin with a quote from Donald Trump that you may have heard. When Mexico sends its people, they're not sending their best. They're not sending you. They're sending people that have lots of problems, and they're bringing their problems. They're bringing drugs. They're bringing crime. They're rapists, and some, I assume, are good people. Now, of course, these remarks were they were in the context of illegal immigration from Mexico. And he made these remarks when he was announcing his candidacy, and they launched the proverbial political firestorm. The political, business, and media establishment threw a fit, accusing Donald Trump, the husband, son, and grandson of immigrants, of being, quote unquote, anti-immigrant, when in fact he is merely opposed to illegal immigration, and there is a considerable difference. But tellingly, not only is the establishment so corrupt that it has no interest in abiding by the law or making the distinction between legal and illegal immigration, but the very first reaction, interestingly, from Donald Trump's critics was to strike out at him financially. In other words, not to debate the issue, but to intimidate him into silence. Univision abruptly canceled its contract with Trump to carry the Trump-owned Miss Universe and Miss USA pageants. Likewise, NBC, the network that had televised his famous Apprentice shows, severed its longtime ties to Donald Trump. The network issued a statement that said, quote, due to the recent derogatory statements by Donald Trump regarding immigrants, NBC Universal is ending its business relationship with Mr. Trump. At NBC, respect and dignity for all people are cornerstones of our values, unquote. Note well that NBC changed Trump's point about illegal immigrants and remade it into the straw man of immigrants. So too did Macy's play the straw man game, announcing the department store chain would no longer be carrying Trump's signature ties and menswear collection, sniffing, and I quote, we welcome all customers, and respect for the dignity of all people is a cornerstone of our culture. We are disappointed and distressed by recent remarks about immigrants from Mexico. In light of statements made by Donald Trump, we have decided to discontinue our business relationship, unquote. What happened? Almost immediately, Donald Trump's poll numbers began to soar and soar and soar. Why? Because Americans understood Trump's plain-spoken words were accurate. America, a nation based not on racial or ethnic identity, but on principles of freedom and liberty, is the only country in the world whose population is filled 100% with the descendants of immigrants. The problem is not immigration per se, but illegal immigration. Everyone in this room, everyone in all of our families is descended from someone who came to America from somewhere else. Heather McDonald of the Manhattan Institute reported as long ago as 2004 that, for example, and I'm quoting her here, in Los Angeles, 95% of all outstanding warrants for homicide, which total 12 to 1,500, target illegal aliens. Up to 2/3 of all fugitive felony warrants, 17,000, are for illegal aliens, unquote. Donald Trump knows that, the American people know that, but the political establishment wants to sweep such statistics under the rug, regardless of what that means for American citizens. Let me give you an example. At 8:40 p.m. on Sunday, March 2nd, 2008, 17-year-old Jamil Shaw Jr., a young African-American, was walking home from the mall with two friends. Jamil's combination of athletic prowess, he was a Los Angeles high school football star, and high academics were already drawing attention from Stanford and Rutgers. He wanted to be a sports agent. He was 3 doors away from home when a white car pulled up. Inside were 18th Street gang members, Joel Killer Rodriguez, Yesenia Sanchez, and Pedro Darky Espinoza. Espinoza jumped out, mistaking Jamil for someone else, and approached him. Born in Mexico and brought to America when he was 3 years old by his illegal immigrant and allegedly abusive parents, Pedro Darky Espinoza had joined the 18th Street gang specifically to become a killer. He told his parole officer his ambition in life was to land on death row. Darky had been released from prison only the day before, after serving time for assault with a deadly weapon. Now, 1 day out, he had already obtained another gun in California, a state with the toughest gun control laws in the country. Jamil had been on his cell phone talking with his girlfriend, Crystal Miles. He suddenly stopped talking. Crystal could hear a voice demand of Jamil, "Where are you from?" Before Jamil could respond, Darky pulled the gun and shot Jamil in the stomach. As the 17-year-old lay on the sidewalk, writhing in pain, Darky Espinoza stood over him, pointed the gun at Jamil's head, execution style, and pulled the trigger. Jamil's father, Jamil Shaw Sr., heard the gunshots and ran out of his house, fearing the worst. The local NBC affiliate later reported, quote, "The first law enforcement officer on the scene, a veteran LAPD sergeant, said the scene of Shaw's murder was, quote, the most sorrow and despair I've ever seen, unquote, describing the sight of Jamil Shaw Sr. screaming in agony at the sight of his son's body. Jamil's mother, U.S. Army Sergeant Anita Shaw, called home from Iraq in desperate hope that there was some mistake, that her baby, as she called him, had not been cold-bloodedly murdered. She sobbed, "Tell me it's not my son." 6 days later, Pedro Darky Espinoza was arrested and charged with the murder of Jamil Andre Shaw Jr. When Donald Trump took to the podium to announce his candidacy and denounce illegal aliens who were, quote-unquote, bringing crime to American streets, he did so with a desire to protect families like the Shaws. But it isn't just Americans who need the protection. In fact, many of the illegals themselves need protection. Why? Here is the New York Times in 2013 on the brutal reality of illegal immigration today. Quote, in State Line, Tucson, Arizona. In the Pima County Medical Examiner's Office here, repository of the nation's largest collection of missing persons reports for immigrants who have vanished while crossing the United States-Mexico border, 774 sets of remains awaited identification in mid-May, stored in musty body bags coated in dust. The largest number of the deaths last year, meaning 2012, occurred along the punishing stretch of desert that spans the southernmost tip of the Border Patrol's Tucson sector, the busiest along the border. Assembling the remains, like linking a mandible that arrived in the office early this spring to a set of remains that was missing one, is like solving a grisly puzzle. It requires manually searching the color-coded paper case files lining the walls in the doctor's office, one shelf for cases from the late 1990s when there were few, and the rest for the more than 2,100 deaths since 2001, unquote. Illegal immigration's victims lie on both sides of the border. It is simply wrong to put American lives at risk, and it is equally wrong to leave our border so undefended that illegal aliens are tempted to risk their lives and often lose their lives trying to make the journey, often through the agency of unscrupulous and abusive people smugglers. Until Donald Trump raised the subject, confronting the human cost of illegal immigration was a third rail that few politicians dared touch. And certainly, no one has addressed the issue as frankly as Trump has done. Among the millions of Americans who appreciate his honesty about illegal immigration and his compassion for illegal immigration's victims are the parents of Jamil Shaw. They met with Donald Trump and publicly endorsed him because they felt until Trump came along, no one was willing to tell the truth about the crimes of illegal immigrants. Jamil Shaw Sr. sat down with Fox News' Neil Cavuto and told him that, quote, for the first time, unquote, since his son was murdered 8 years ago, he and fellow victims of illegal immigrant felons, quote, feel hope. We feel change coming, unquote. He added, quote, Donald Trump brought in fresh air. Donald Trump made us think like, oh, you know, maybe we have a chance to get our country back, or at least makes the citizens safe. That if you're going to force this illegal immigration down our throat, at least you owe us the safety part of it to make sure our loved ones aren't being murdered in the streets, unquote. The political establishment had not previously shown much concern for families like the Shaws. When Anita Shaw said that, quote, I felt everyone was trying to keep it quiet. I felt like because Pedro Espinosa was an illegal alien, it was all right that he killed my son, unquote. She was not wrong. From the U.S. Chamber of Commerce to the Wall Street Journal to establishment Republicans, let alone the liberal Democrats who see electoral gains to be made through massive demographic change, the push has been on for what is called, quote unquote, comprehensive immigration reform, unquote, seen by millions of Americans as nothing short of amnesty for all illegal aliens, and even a move to put them in the front of the line ahead of those who have followed the law and played by the rules. To the establishment, borders are almost a scandal. The response of Donald Trump, if we don't have borders, we don't have a country. Now, if we've learned anything in the last year, it is that the American people are looking for, make that demanding change. And it isn't just immigration policy that they want changed. They want honesty in discussing our problems. And they want the next president to be someone who is prepared to challenge the status quo, to think outside the box, to be willing to take on the special interests that have run Washington and, yes, the Republican Party, like a club for insiders. And speaking of the Republican Party, where have we heard this demand for change in the party before? In 1976, former California Governor Ronald Reagan challenged incumbent moderate Republican President Gerald Ford for the GOP nomination. He lost, and he lost in no small part because Ford and his establishment GOP allies succeeded in making Republican voters believe that, in President Ford's words, Ronald Reagan was too extreme to ever win a national election. As I well recall, my elders here in the Pennsylvania Republican Party made it clear only a moderate establishment Republican could carry Pennsylvania. Ford won the nomination, and that fall lost both Pennsylvania and the nation to Jimmy Carter. A month later, Governor Reagan sat down with a reporter from the New York Times for an interview. The Times ran the interview on December 16, 1976, and I have a copy of the original article. Under the headline, Reagan urges his party to save itself by declaring its conservative beliefs. The very first sentence of that interview reads this way, quote, Ronald Reagan made it clear today that he intends to play a major role in rebuilding the Republican Party by courting conservatives who now call themselves Democrats and independents, unquote. Reagan went on to say that in his view, the GOP establishment of the day had run the party like, these are his words exactly, a fraternal order, when in fact it should be run as a place where people gather because, he said, quote unquote, they are bound together by a shared political philosophy, unquote. Reagan went on to do just that. 4 years later, he defeated Jimmy Carter in a 44-state landslide. And yes, he carried Pennsylvania. 4 years later, he carried 49 states, including Pennsylvania yet again. 4 years after that, running as Reagan's heir for what was called in the day Reagan's third term, Vice President George H.W. Bush won a third landslide. And yes, he carried Pennsylvania a third time. But then something happened. President Bush, a good and decent man, an American hero, as we all know, turned away from conservatism to return the party to the politics of the fraternal order. 4 years later, President Bush lost his own re-election, winning a mere 37% of the vote. The country was turned over to Bill and Hillary Clinton. And not only did Bush lose Pennsylvania, from that day until this day, no Republican has ever carried Pennsylvania again. I would respectfully suggest that the days of the Fraternal Order Republican Party should once again come to an end. It's time once again to open the doors, as President Reagan did, to, quote, conservatives who now call themselves Democrats and independents, unquote. Donald Trump shares this view, and in fact, it is exactly these kind of voters, Reagan Democrats as they were once called, who have responded so dramatically to Donald Trump in this election season. I would go so far as to suggest that Reagan Democrats can now be called Trump Democrats. And as we did in 1980, the GOP should welcome these voters into our tent. Let me close by quoting Donald Trump. I love America, and when you love something, you protect it passionately, fiercely even. We are the greatest country the world has ever known. I make no apologies for this country, my pride in it, or my desire to see us become strong and rich again. After all, wealth funds our freedom, but for too long we've been pushed around, used by other countries, and ill-served by politicians in Washington who measure their success by how rapidly they can expand the federal debt and your tax burden with their favorite government programs. Americans can do better. I think we deserve the best, unquote. I agree, and I hope you do too. I'm glad we're here, that we all have this discussion. And I should add, parenthetically, I guess, that I know Ted Cruz, and I love him to death. I think he's great. I frequently refer to him as Vice President Cruz. America does deserve the best. Donald Trump believes, as most Americans traditionally have, that we are a country set apart, an exceptional country, a country of opportunity and liberty. It is a country that we need to make great again, not just for ourselves, but for generations of Pennsylvanians and Americans to come. Thank you.